안녕하세요. Good morning. I apologize, I don't speak Korean, though I used to live in Korea. One of the most interesting things for me is that Korea is one of the most innovative markets in the world. And I've learned a lot from my time in Korea and working with people like Mr. Han from Hana Financial. But what's really interesting about technology today is the speed and scale with which it's changing. And I think Brett King did a great job at talking about some of those trends. But our world is changing, and it's changing incredibly quickly. And one of the great things about innovation is it's very obvious in hindsight.
Essay about the future. In the future, a telephone will be so small that we can put it in our pocket and take it with us everywhere. We can see whom we're speaking with on a small screen, and we can watch the news and TV shows on the phone all day. We can also listen to the radio by putting tiny speakers into our ears. The phone will have a built-in camera. You can see live football matches on the phone. You can play fun games and send pictures and messages invisible through the air. There's also a kind of gramophone inside the phone, and thousands of great songs will come into the phone through the air. And do you know what else? You can make your own movie with your phone, and you can record sounds, and you can even create your own ringtones.
And I love that it's Nokia. But the truth is, when you work with major corporations, often that's exactly the kind of reaction that you get. You're seen to be a bit of a lunatic when you talk about these things. But what we're noticing in markets today is a very fundamental shift. And it's a shift that's as fundamental as in 1908, Henry Ford said that you could have it in any color as long as it's black. And with that, he changed the Industrial Revolution to start making industry around productivity. And for many, many years, for many decades, companies have focused on how to make themselves more efficient. In banking, I was Chief Innovation Officer at DBS Bank. That used to manifest in asking questions in our forums. So our questions would be, are you Mr., Mrs., or Ms.? And the next question asked if you're male or female, like we couldn't work it out. But it was actually designed around internal productivity to make someone's data entry easier. But those questions persist, and it makes no sense. But today we're moving to a very different age, and we're into the age of customer productivity. And we're starting to see that need and that transformation really dramatically changing how we're architecting our institutions. And very much today, as Brett highlighted, that industry disruption is happening yet again, and particularly around artificial intelligence, with a scale and speed that's quite unprecedented in history. In financial services, we've often taken the view that it doesn't happen in our industry. And that's very simply because we're regulated and protected. And that excuse no longer exists, because we're starting to notice that something strange is happening in regulatory markets around the world. So if we listen to this speech, and Brett used Jack Ma, so this is a different one, but we're starting to see that people challenge those very regulatory foundations.
I remember 9 years ago when I started Alipay. People say, Jack,
9 years ago when he started Alipay.
Because it's illegal, you may be in prison.
You may be in prison because it's illegal to compete.
And we taught ourselves if we don't do it, the China e-commerce will always like a chat room. Everybody say, it's a good thing, and I don't pay, you don't get the things. So I say, well, put me in the prison. Let's make sure that Alipay, the payment solution, works. And people say the payment solution is such a stupid idea. It's an escrow service. I pay you, hold the money, and you get the things. You pay the money. If you don't get the things you want, return the money. They say it's a stupid product. And I say, as long as it solves the problem, I like stupid things, you know. Let's make stupid things smart. Keep on improving every day. Today, we have over 800 million people registered using Alipay.
800 million people, it's over 900 million now, and Brett covered off exactly how big an institution that's become. But Jack was prepared to go to jail because it was illegal. So the question is, why did the regulators stand by and let 900 million people use an illegal service? And what we're seeing playing out in regulatory markets around the world is this, is that we're moving to a frame of regulatory observation and engagement rather than the usual, I talk to the regulator and they say no. This is changing. And we're actually seeing in some jurisdictions that the regulator is actually the one driving this. So in India, for example, we're seeing moves that I would have thought impossible in my lifetime where the regulator is actually driving identity and removing a lot of that friction from the system directly. In Singapore, a hybrid model. In Hong Kong, a hybrid model. Different regulators have different approaches, but until we understand the technology we're dealing with, it's very difficult to regulate against it. So the first step is around regulatory engagement and learning. And I think that what we really need to understand is the principle of when regulators step back into observation versus direct intervention. And that's generally doing what Alipay did, is to drive financial inclusion. Because the reality is today, much of what we do in financial institutions is not correlated to financial inclusion, it's actually correlated to a very much higher transaction cost, which excludes a great degree of the market. So when we think about disruption, what's really being disrupted? If we have a look at Jack Ma's company, it started connecting consumers to small businesses. And yet, as Brett highlighted, in a period of 10 months, it grew to become the 4th largest money markets funds manager in the world with no prior experience, which is an incredible growth rate from a company that didn't have that as a core competence or core business. And the impact that was forecast on the back of this and other events that are happening around the world is the bank revenues will decline 35%. Why is that? I think the reality is it's quite simple. We're starting to see transaction cost falling, which doesn't necessarily mean that profit's being carved out of the market. It just means the transaction cost side. So if you can't compete on transaction cost, you simply can't compete. And we're seeing the same thing happening in insurance, and it's happening with speed and scale. If we have a look at a company called Zhong'an in China, you may not have heard of it, but it's the fastest growing financial institution in the world in terms of customer acquisition. In their first 12 months of operation, 150 million clients, and they wrote 630 million policies around microinsurance. And just 3 years later, that's 415 million customers and 5 billion policies written. As formerly heading innovation for AIA, we took great pride in the fact that we'd written 40 million policies over the last 100 years. But the problem in most institutions is when we talk about this, we're pretty much told that it's low margin, low impact, don't bother. But what's interesting is that's also the philosophy they took when Amazon was dismissed as being low margin, low impact in US retail. And I think we now see those results around the world to understand that what they really did is completely change the customer experience and transaction cost base. And this is the most important graph in all of technology. It's called the long tail. Because what we fail to understand is that if transaction cost is in the left axis and market access is on the horizontal axis, we miss that behavioral change occurs in the long tail, the mass consumer. It doesn't occur in the left side of the graph where we traditionally focus on higher transaction cost and higher value. And so when these disruptive companies change the market behavior, then we see real disruption and transformation. And what it looks like financially, and these are two actual companies, is we see that an incumbent that has a high growth rate is actually looking like they're pulling away from this startup, and so we'll dismiss it and dismiss it. But if the underlying growth rate is exceptionally high off a low base, as we've seen time and time again in these disruptive plays, then all of a sudden, you know, if you were talking 5 years ago about Alibaba in financial services, it was zero. You talk about Zhong'an in insurance, and they're only 3 years old, you dismiss them. But the speed and scale at which they grow and which they learn about customers and interaction is really phenomenal. And by the time you realize you need to react, it's often too late. But this is summed up actually in ancient philosophy by a not so ancient guy, and it's a guy called Mike Tyson. He said, everyone has a plan until they're punched in the face. And unfortunately, we tend to wait until we've actually, suddenly our numbers are going down, we think it's a bad quarter, then the second quarter comes and then they go down further, and then you realize you have a serious problem, and it's too late to react. What we're seeing in the rise of artificial intelligence is that people are starting to tinker around the edges of it. But this is another change in scale of technology that's unprecedented in history. And for many, it's obvious to resist. We resisted in medical. In fact, the AMA last year, the Doctors Association in the US, called it snake oil. 12 months later, we're predicting heart attacks. And the difference between getting a 10-minute warning on a heart attack is that after 13 minutes after your heart attack, you have a 4% survival rate. So it's not just financial, it's human. We're starting to see Watson outperforming in certain areas of cancer diagnosis. I've had people in my own accelerator from DeepMind when I was at AIA that took 2 weeks to outperform radiologists. That as a career is gone. The machines are far more accurate. And this is happening in many industries. So very simply, robots aren't coming, they're already here. Real or not real? Show of hands, real? Available for sale next year in the consumer market. Now, if you connect this to a smart fridge, who's going to be ordering and transacting on your shopping? If you think about medical and tracking what you eat and combining it with technologies today that are coming available through FDA that will enable you to measure your chemistry from the inside, to use your pharmacogenomics to determine what drugs are available and how that affects your diet and metabolism. What we're living in is an age where we're displacing information and risk through insight. And when we think about drone deliveries, etc., again, this is becoming real in our lifetime. Now, who's transacting behind this? And are we prepared financially to deal with that in our finance system? How do we identify an authenticated drone? There's many types of challenges, but one is the most important thing, I think, from a financial institution standpoint, is we need to start rethinking our business models. The simple fact is robots are getting smart. And to really understand why, I came from the tech industry, there are 3 core technology laws. And it's very important to understand what these laws are. Moore's law is processing power. Basically, processing doubles every 18 months for the same cost, which means smarter for a fraction of the price. So when we looked at artificial intelligence, and in DBS we were the first bank to do artificial intelligence at the core, what it meant that every 18 months would be 100% better. And our relationship managers, at best, would be 3 to 5% better. So you're on a completely different productivity curve. And I think that that's really important to understand. If we have a look at Metcalfe's law is the law of networks that says that value grows at the square of the participants, which is why when you see people like Jack Ma with massive consumer bases now moving into adjacent industries, their marginal cost of customer acquisition is incredibly low. How do you compete against that if your cost structure is not aligned to competitors?